pretty clear point of view one way or the other. And for me, like you heard in the introduction, this is a deeply personal issue as well. Growing up, the state of Israel was like my extended family. So this is beyond the issue. This is also very personal for me. But I'd just like to put that out there, particularly if there are people who have strong positive feelings towards the state of Israel. Some of the things I say are extremely difficult to hear. Now, I believe that a good time to start talking about this conflict in terms of how it began is exactly the 29th of November, 1947, which is when the United Nations came up with this map. So the United Nations decided to partition Palestine, and this was the partition resolution, and this is what the map looked like. And even if you knew nothing about the issue, if you look at the map, imagine you were the person that was supposed to go actually on the ground and mark the borders. I mean, look at it. It's an absurd creation. How do you even go on the ground and mark these borders? But beyond that, when we look at the actual what they did with this map, with the partition, the United Nations partitioned the Palestine, and they decided that they were going to give the larger portion of the country to a small group of immigrants, Jewish immigrants, who numbered less than 500,000 people, in order for them to establish a state. And they allocated the smaller portion of the country to the native Palestinian population, who numbered close to 1.5 million, for them to create their state. And to this day, people will say, you know, all of this conflict is all the Palestinians' fault because they rejected this. And you have to wonder, did anybody expect that they would not reject this? Is there anybody who would accept something like this, that the United Nations would come, cut off the larger portion of their country and give it to somebody else? Not to mention a small group of immigrants, mostly immigrants. This was the generation of my grandparents and my parents. And at this point, something very interesting happens. The two narratives diverge. And normally when you have an argument about things, typically you agree on some of the basic facts. And then you argue over analyzing the facts or, understanding them or how to implement things or apply things. Here, the argument is on the basic facts. What happened exactly at that moment or from this moment on? And the story that I was raised on, and the story that people here in the United States and generally in the West are raised on, is that after the Arabs rejected, and we don't say Palestinians typically in Zionist language, we say Arabs. The Arabs rejected the partition plan. They began a massive attack against the Jewish community in an attempt to destroy them and kill them, destroy the community and kill the Jews. And when you learn this in the context of the way Israel typically in the West teach Jewish history, this is one more in a very long line of situations, circumstances where somebody was trying to kill the Jews. So it kind of makes sense. The Nazis were just a few years before that. Now the Arabs, before that there were the Greeks and the Romans, and everybody's always trying to kill us. And so the Arabs are just one more in a long line of people who wanted to kill us, but miraculously we were able to defeat them and establish a Jewish state. And within 12 months, the Jewish state was established, these Arabs were defeated, and so on. And this makes sense because we are the descendants of King David, who beat Goliath. And we are the descendants of the Maccabees, who defeated great empires. So in terms of the narrative, this makes perfect sense. And as you grow up as a child learning this, it's a wonderful story. And you really want to believe that, particularly in my case, when my father was an officer in these Jewish forces, the Zionist forces that fought in 1948. But when we take a closer look at what actually took place at that time and at that place, things look a little bit different. When we look at the two communities, both the Jewish community, that, like I said, numbered less than 500,000, and the Palestinian community numbered almost 1.5 million, we see two communities that were expecting to become states. So they had institutions of state. And they did everything they could in order to be recognized as a state. But there was one thing that the Jewish community, and really we should call them the Zionist community, because these were Jews who followed the call of Zionism to create this Jewish state in Palestine. The Zionist community developed one thing that the Palestinians never did, and that was a militia. It was a fighting force. So by that time, the Zionist militias numbered close to 40,000 very well-trained, well-armed, and very well-indoctrinated young men. And like I said, my father was an officer in that militia. There was no equivalent on the Palestinian side. There was no Palestinian militia. There was no Palestinian army. In fact, there never has been a Palestinian army to this day. So who are these Arabs that attacked? Now, we know that the Arab states didn't intervene until much later, till later on, 6, 7 months later. So who are the Arabs that attacked in 1947? Well, there were no Arabs that attacked, because as soon as this resolution was accepted by the United Nations, the Zionist forces began a campaign of terrorizing and ethnic cleansing that lasted 12 months, at the end of which the State of Israel was established. Then later on, when the Arab armies did intervene, they were defeated very easily by the Zionist forces. So now, when we take a look at this picture, what were they able to do in 12 months? They were able to conquer almost 80% of the country. They were able to displace close to 1 million people. And they were able to destroy hundreds and hundreds of towns and cities and villages, some of them as you know, that went back with a history of 1,000 years and more, including, you know, churches and mosques and schools and, of course, homes and everything else, completely destroy them. And this they were able to do within a 12-month period. But now the story makes sense because there was no opposition, or there was very little opposition. And that's how they were able to do this. Now, one of the things that I do in the book is I go back between the history and the story of the state and the land and its people and in my own family and how they influenced it and how they took part. And there's a story. This is my mother when she was young. And my mother was born and raised in Jerusalem. She's 86 years old now. She still lives in Jerusalem. And this is a story that she told me many, many times as I was growing up. And she was 22 years old. It was 1948. The war was going on. My father was in the front fighting for the cause. And she was already a mother, and she was living with my older siblings in a small apartment with her mother in Jerusalem. Now, when I say Jerusalem, I don't mean the old city of Jerusalem. I mean the neighborhoods that were outside of Jerusalem, what's considered West Jerusalem, and later on became the Israeli side of Jerusalem. And there were many Palestinian neighborhoods there, very well-to-do neighborhoods. In fact, many of those homes are still there. And if you've been to Jerusalem, you see their homes, these homes. They're very distinct neighborhoods and very distinct, beautiful homes. Well, when the Zionist forces came in, they took those neighborhoods, they forced the people into exile, the inhabitants into exile. And these homes were made available for Israeli families. And my mother was offered one of these homes. And like I say, I can't remember when she told me this the first time, but I remember hearing it my entire life. And then when I was working on the book, we talked about it more. And she always talks about the story with the exact same emotion. And the way she says it, she says, how could I possibly take the home of another family? How could I possibly move into the home of another mother that now has to raise her family in exile? And then she goes on to describe the loot, how the Zionist forces filled their trucks with loot, furniture, and rugs. And you may have heard rare manuscripts and thousands of books. And how were they not ashamed? And she always expresses the sense of shame having seen these Israelis do this. And she says the story, this is also part of the story, is that when the Israeli forces came in to these homes, the coffee was still warm on the table. In other words, the families had just. Now, what was interesting is that this story always bothered me, and it wasn't until I was actually working on the book that I could reconcile why it was bothering me. The story actually contradicts the national narrative because she's expressing a moral dilemma here. And the way the Israeli narrative is, there is no moral dilemma here at all, because they attacked us, we won, and they left. So there's no moral dilemma in taking their home. What she's presenting is in a way that we did something wrong. Now, not only is she presenting in a way that we did something wrong, but there's no excuse to it. And typically in Israeli discourse, even when we acknowledge situations where Israel did something wrong, for example, the massacre of Deir Yassin, which was a village in the outskirts of Jerusalem that had surrendered, and the Zionist forces committed a terrible massacre there. And this is acknowledged, and this is taught in Israeli school books. But the way this is taught is that Chaim Weizmann, who was later the first president of the State of Israel, said that although the massacre was a terrible thing, thanks to the massacre, thousands of Arabs fled, and this allowed us to create a Jewish majority. So even though the massacre was bad, in the end there was a good outcome. And this is typically how we talk about things when we do acknowledge them as Israelis that we did wrong. There's always a good outcome. There's always something good that happened to us, and so maybe it's not so bad. She didn't do that. There was no excuse. There was no but. It was just we did something wrong, and that's the end of the story. And again, like I said, it bothered me for many, many years. And typically, quite often when I give this talk and I tell this story, Palestinians, especially if they're older Palestinians in the room, they come up to me afterwards and tell me, our parents own one of those homes. And like I said, most of those homes are still there. Now, some of you may have heard the term Nakba. The Nakba is what the Palestinians call the War of 1948. And I remember when I first heard this, I was insulted. The War of 1948 was the war of our independence. This was the war after which the state of Israel was established. How can anybody call such an important historic event a Nakba? Nakba means catastrophe. How can they call it a catastrophe? I understand they don't like it, but a catastrophe. And like I said, I was personally insulted. And over the years, I began to realize and understand and meet Palestinians and kind of my journey into Palestine, which is described in the book, why it's called a catastrophe and why it was a catastrophe. But I think what people don't realize often is that catastrophe wasn't something that happened in 1948. It was something that began in 1948 and is still going on today. This picture, these children in a refugee camp called the Gaza refugee camp. It's in Jordan. And I visited recently. And you can see the sewer running through the street, if you can call it a street. The homes, such as they are small and cold. There's no electricity, no running water, no sewage, no health care. They're so poor that they can't afford matches to light a fire to make tea in the winter. And it gets very cold there. It's up in the north. And you have to wonder, this is no more than an hour and a half from Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa. And this is happening today, under our watch. This is a catastrophe. This is a Nakba. That these children have to grow up in these conditions just a few miles away from their parents' and grandparents' homes. This is a catastrophe that's being allowed to go on to this day. And I've never seen such poverty, and I've been to a lot of places, refugee camps and third world countries and so forth. This is inexcusable. This is not some sub-Saharan Africa, days drive or days flight from other places. This is within hours of the best, the most modern cities within Israel. This is the catastrophe. This is the Nakba. Another example, of course, is Gaza itself. When kids go to school, they go through many homes that look like this. This is a result of an Israeli air raid. And in this particular home, an entire family was killed. I think 13 people were killed. And there are many cases like that, many examples of this in Gaza. I was just there, by the way. And the father and one of the children, just by mistake, were not home at the moment that this happened, so they were saved. And the kids, the next door neighbors, the ones that homes don't look like this, maybe a few houses down, don't know if their house is going to be next. If they go to school and when they come back, will they have a home? Will they have a family? This is a Nakba. This is a catastrophe. It's happening now under our watch every single day. Now, after 1948, this is what the Latin map looked like. Israel conquered, or the Israeli forces conquered almost 80% of the country, with the exception of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Almost entire Palestine, 80% of Palestine became Israel. And for the Israeli forces, for the commanders like my father, the fact that the West Bank was not included, was not conquered, was not taken, was a very sore subject. And we'll see how that comes to play later on. But for them, there was a big mistake. It was a political decision that the military did not agree to. But this is how it was for 20 years. And then, of course, as I'm sure all of you know, in the spring and summer of 1967, the drums of war were beating. The Egyptian president, Nasser, allowed his forces to go into the Sinai Peninsula, violating the ceasefire agreement between the two countries, and threats of war were being made. And the Israeli High Command decided that this was an opportunity for war, and they need to engage in a preemptive strike. And they tried to convince the Israeli cabinet to allow them to do this. The cabinet was hesitant. And these commanders, the high command, my father was already one of them at that point, these were the young officers of 1948. So these are the ones that remained in the military 20 years later. They're generals, and they're very young generals. They were in their early to mid-40s. And they were very assertive. There wasn't a single battle that they ever lost. And they wanted more, and they were ready for war. And the story that we hear about this war is that once again, Israel was under an existential threat. Once again, Arab armies were intending to destroy it and kill all the Jews. And once again, the Jewish forces, the Israeli forces, were able to defeat the Arabs and increase the size of the state of Israel threefold. And once again, we, the children, the descendants of King David and the descendants of the Maccabees and the descendants of the people who defeated the Arabs in 1948, because it's the exact same narrative, once again, we were victorious. Now, eventually, like it always happens in Israeli politics, the more militant wave always wins. And so, of course, the generals got their way and they were given permission, they were given the okay to begin a preemptive strike against Egypt. That went on that went very well. It didn't take very long for the Egyptian army to be destroyed. The Sinai Peninsula was taken, and then they went on and took the West Bank and took the Golan Heights. Now, like I said earlier, for the generals, the fact that the West Bank was not included in Israel in 48 was a big mistake. They took the opportunity on their own, by the way, without cabinet approval, took the West Bank, which they, of course, wanted for a long time, like I said, and the Golan Heights, which was an area they wanted to take from Syria for a very long time. Now, what's interesting is this. This is, by the way, a picture of my father, the general. The book is titled The General's Son, and then The Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. As I was working on the book, I looked into I went to the Israeli archives to learn about my father's military career. And one of the most interesting aspects these interesting parts were the actual minutes of the meetings of the generals leading up to the 67 war. They're available. A lot of historians have seen them, written about them, documentaries have been made about that period. It was a very interesting period because of the tension between the cabinet and the generals. And so I wasn't really expecting to see anything I didn't know. But as soon as I began reading those transcripts, those minutes, I saw something my father say, and then some of the other generals said, and that is the Egyptian army was not prepared for war. The Egyptians were advancing an ill-prepared army, that they would need at least 1.5 to 2 years to be really prepared for war, and therefore, we now have an opportunity to destroy the Egyptian army, and that's why we need to engage in a preemptive strike. Not a single word about a threat. In fact, they say we can attack now, or we can attack a month from now, it makes no difference, but we might as well attack now, because we're going to be victorious either way. So what happened to the existential threat? These were the commanders. These were they had the army intelligence. These were the commanders that knew. They were charged with the security. They knew what they were talking about. Not a single word about a threat. And later on, my father and several of the other generals said, admittedly, that this was not a war of defense. This was a war of choice. But it was kind of covered up by the story of the existential threat because it makes for better mythology. And now, once again, the story makes sense. You had a fully prepared army, fully motivated, with a well-planned plan of attack, destroyed the Egyptian army. Then they went on to destroy the Jordanian and Syrian army, was certainly no match for the Israeli army. And within 6 days, they took the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai. They destroyed 3 Arab armies, killing more than 15,000 Arab soldiers in 6 days, at a loss of 700 soldiers, Israeli soldiers. Of course, every soldier is somebody's son, so we cry for every soldier that dies, but the difference between 700 and 15,000 is a striking difference. Now, something very interesting happened. As soon as the war was over, the very first meeting of the generals, the high command had, my father stood up and he said, now we have an opportunity to make peace with the Palestinians and solve the Palestinian issue. He said, we've conquered all this land, we've asserted ourselves beyond any doubt, but we still have another nation here that we need to deal with. If we maintain these territories, if we occupy the West Bank and keep the people within, the Arabs that live there, we're going to become either a binational state, which is not what we fought for, or we're going to become a brutal occupying power. And so that was when the idea of the two-state solution was voiced for the very first time. But as he was saying these things, the state of Israel had already begun destroying towns and cities in the West Bank, expelling hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, and beginning a massive campaign of building for Israeli Jews only. This was happening immediately as the smoke was still in the air. And at that point, he and the Israeli establishment kind of parted ways. And he went on to talk about the need to solve the Palestinian problem, and the state of Israel went on continuing to build and expel and destroy. Basically what happened was this is what this was the map looked like after the 1967 war. Palestine was erased completely off the map, and the state of Israel took its place, and a very powerful campaign, an unstoppable campaign to integrate the West Bank into the rest of Israel began. And it was a very successful campaign because today the West Bank is fully integrated into Israel. So, the mission was erasing Palestine, and they succeeded. They conquered the land. They engaged in a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, just like they did in the other parts of Palestine after 1948. And they began massive building for Israeli Jews only, just like they did after 1948, like I said, integrating the West Bank. So today when people talk about the possibility of Israel allowing the Palestinians to establish a state anywhere within that map, it's a complete misunderstanding and a complete misreading of what Israel is all about and what Zionism is all about. The mission is to take the land of Israel and give it to the Jewish people and get rid of anybody who might be in the way. That's the mission, and that's what it's all about. The possibility of allowing anybody to develop, to establish a state within these boundaries is absolutely absurd. Now, there's another issue that takes place, and that is the fact that Palestine was actually an Arab country for 1,500 years until the State of Israel was established. So you have Arab cities and towns and names and monuments and a whole Arab culture that's part of this land, part of this place. So everything has to be destroyed. So cities and towns were destroyed. Names are being changed. Some names are still being changed. And a new history is being created linking today's Israel with the ancient Hebrews, King David, and so on. And one example, there are many examples, but probably the most striking example is taking place in a place called Silwan. If you've been to the old city of Jerusalem, you know where the Jewish quarter is, you go out the gate and you go down the hill, there's a big community called Silwan. It's a community of over 50,000 people. And someone decided, and it's right just down the hill from the Jewish quarter, and someone decided that under the homes of the people in Silwan is where the true city of David existed. So the homes of the people of Silwan are being destroyed. An archaeological park has already been established called the City of David. Tour buses are already going there. The homes in the periphery of the park are already being destroyed because of the digging, their foundations are being destroyed. And Israeli settlers are taking over homes that are in the farther periphery. So because there are Jewish settlers there, Israeli settlers, you have to have a massive military force there as well. So this is ethnic cleansing, de-Arabizing, and destruction all at the same time. And this is a community of 50,000 people. It's happening in broad daylight right outside the old city of Jerusalem. Tour buses see this every single day. And this is it. This is done under our watch. This is the Nakba. This is the ongoing catastrophe. Nobody cares. Nobody says a word. An entire community of 50,000 people. I live in a city that's less than 30,000 people. I can't imagine here in the United States somebody coming and saying, well, we're going to destroy these homes because, Zeus used to live here. And of course, there is no historical proof that there ever was a King David. And God knows Israeli historians and archaeologists have tried to prove this for a very long time and haven't found a single shred of evidence. But that doesn't matter because the past trumps the present. And what's important is to create this mythology that links Israel, today's Israel, with King David because it's very romantic and it allows Israel to continue to do what it does so well. It's hard to talk about this without the issue of the question of what they call terrorism or the Palestinian resistance. And I talk about this quite a lot in my book. I've interviewed and spoken to many friends of mine, Palestinian friends of mine, who are prisoners. And Israel has had and still has thousands and thousands of political prisoners, of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons, in Israeli jails, in violation of international law. Now, a research just came out, an excellent book just came out called Threat. And in this book, they talk about the fact, and it's Israeli and Palestinian writers, over 90% of the Palestinian prisoners have never been charged with violence. So the vast majority of Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails are actually political prisoners. The ones that did engage in armed resistance are a very, very small fraction. So this is important to understand. But of course, Israel and the world calls them terrorists. And I think it's important to realize, especially today, there's so many hunger strikers. In fact, one of them is over 220 days already. Samir Isawi. And I think it's important to remind ourselves of a UN resolution that says that the struggle of people under colonial and alien domination and racist regimes, which I think characterizes Israel very well, for the implementation of their rights to self-determination and independence is legitimate. And I think it's important to say here clearly that the Palestinian resistance is legitimate. Whether we agree with the armed resistance or not, that's another question, but the resistance is a resistance. And it's important to recognize this. These are people who are fighting for their independence and freedom. And this is, of course, in full accordance with the principles of international law. And you cannot talk about, there are two issues you cannot ignore when you talk about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. One is the right of return, like I said earlier, and the other one is the prisoners. There's not a Palestinian family in the West Bank and Gaza that has not had a member of its family in prison, in an Israeli jail. And I don't know if has anybody here seen the movie Five Broken Cameras? Okay, if you haven't, you should. It's an excellent movie. It's a very honest it's a very honest depiction of what it's like to resist, of the story of resistance of the town of Bilain. And the things that these guys suffer, the imprisonment, the torture, the beatings, their children, their families, and so forth. So this issue of the Palestinian resistance, I think it's important. Today people talk about Hamas and they talk about the Qassam rockets, of course. And I think unless we understand that this is part of a resistance, that this is a reaction to the brutality of the occupation, of the oppression by Israel, then we're not really making sense, and we're not really talking about the reality. I think it's important to put that in place. And like I said, in the book, I've interviewed and spoken to many, and I kind of tell the story of quite a few Palestinians who were prisoners. Now, at the end of the book, I discuss, it's actually a discussion, it's a conversation about, well, what's next? How do we move beyond this? Because this is really, and why is there hope, and why do I have hope, and why are people feeling that my book is hopeful? The reality is that Israel created one state on all of historic Palestine. It's the Jewish state. The West Bank has been completely integrated with Israel. So you can't delineate the West Bank or any other place anymore and say, okay, that will be a Palestinian state. And this was done by design. This was done by design. Israeli commanders and politicians and prime ministers have said this. The intention is to make the conquest of the West Bank irreversible, to integrate the West Bank fully into Israel. And they have, with highways and schools and big cities and so on. So the reality is that we have a state, but it's a Jewish state. In other words, it only represents half the population, because only half the population are Jewish, or a little bit more than half. You have about 6.5 million Israelis who are Jewish and about 6 million Palestinians who are not Jewish. But it's a Jewish state over the entire country. So everybody's being governed by different laws, which is why Israel is often compared to apartheid. So for me, I'm an Israeli Jew. It's a democracy. It is a Jewish democracy. If you're an Israeli Jew, it's a democracy. I can say what I like. I can come and go as I like. For Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, there are different sets of laws. And there are laws in the law books that specifically discriminate against them. And they live in an entire environment of discrimination and neglect. The Palestinian communities within Israel are so neglected. In some cases, the situation in these communities is worse than it is in Gaza. And then you have the Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza itself that have absolutely no rights at all. They are at the mercy of the Israeli military. And that military I would categorize as a glorified terrorist organization. So they have commanders and uniforms and tanks and so on, but their main objective is terrorizing a civilian, unarmed population, which is what the Palestinians are. So once again, if we refer back to the Palestinian resistance fighters and to the Israeli soldiers, of which I served in the Israeli army myself, who is really the terrorist? I would claim that I was the terrorist, far more so than any Palestinians in Israeli jails. So we have two nations, we have one state that represents only half of them, but the state controls the entire country. We know for sure, absolutely, Israel has made absolutely clear that partitioning and parting any part of this land in order to create another state will not happen. The only possibilities that we are faced with is leaving things the way they are, and many people think that that's okay, that this is a war that will never end, but as long as Israel is winning and Israel is strong, that's all that matters. Palestinians can die or whatever, nobody cares. And there's another point of view that says, well, this is wrong. Morally, it's wrong. If we care for justice, this is wrong. And it's unsustainable. 6 million people, 6.5 million people can't control 6 million people like this forever. This is going to fall apart. And that's what I think. Besides being morally wrong, and besides being unjust, it's unsustainable.